Europe. I don't know if that means we don't spend enough on our lawns in the US or what. I was going to get one of the quad here, which is kind of in rough shape at the moment, but I didn't. So as mentioned in the intro, I feel like a bit of a fellow traveler in the higher ed space. I no longer work in higher education. I haven't for 18 years now. But that was really my first career. So I went straight from undergrad into graduate school. That's me on the left in the funny looking hat, graduating with my PhD in the spring of 1999. And so I was a graduate student and an instructor. Many of you will know, if you are accustomed to the world of higher education, the importance, the critical importance of the distinction that I was never a member of the faculty. I was merely an instructor. So I just have to be careful. I've had people introduce me and say, he was on the faculty at University of Washington. I'm like, oh no, don't say that, because somebody will get horribly upset. I was only an instructor because I wasn't tenured. Anyway, after spending a couple of years on the market as a newly minted PhD, trying to find a job teaching, applying for jobs in which literally there were 4,000 qualified applicants for a single tenured track position as a professor of English, with a focus on modernism and the American experience, many of whom had several books and 10 years teaching, and I was fresh out of grad school. In my spare time, I was learning about this thing called the web. When I didn't have a teaching fellowship, I was building websites for local businesses. And this was the height of the dot-com explosion, and sort of there were jobs galore to be had. So I said, maybe I'll take this hobby that I've had of building websites and go try that for a while. And that was now nearly 20 years ago. So the picture on the right, that's the 10UP team, or at least all of us who could make our annual summit. 10UP, if you don't know us, is a full-service digital agency, design, strategy, development of sites for publishers, higher educational institutions, people with large-scale content opportunities. And we're a fully distributed company. So I happen to be in Boston, Massachusetts. This is our Team All Hands Summit in Jackson Hole. So we get together once a year, all in one place. So in between academia and 10UP, I went through a whole commercial CMS phase. Interwoven team site, Vignette, Documentum, Stellent, which some of you may know as Oracle Content Management, depending on the era. Then arrived at kind of Drupal, Sitecore, and WordPress, which is where I've spent the last 10 years, kind of across those three platforms. 10UP tends to focus more on WordPress as a platform, but I still kind of follow those three platforms more than others. So as we go through the talk today, that'll be evident. When we talk about content management in higher education, first of all, it's important to have pictures of cute dogs throughout your presentation because it calms you down and it makes the audience happy. When we talk about content management systems in education, I think one of the things that the industry fails to recognize is the complexity that you all have. So people think about what content management system do you use, as though that's an answer that a question that has one answer, right? And very rare, there are probably a few of them in the room because of excellent work by people in this room who are focused and use WordPress for 90% of the sites on campus, or even 100% of the sites on campus, but it's exceedingly rare. Almost every institution of any significant complexity has multiples, right? How does that happen? Say you started out with a single site, your .edu site, represented by this single dog. Then it becomes 3 sites, because now in addition to your primary .edu platform, you've got an admissions group, right, or enrollment marketing, as it's cool to call them now. And that group actually generates money, so they get empowered to create their own site off the platform that the primary .edu uses. Then maybe you have alumni who also generate money in their own way. Maybe you have development, maybe you have athletics, right? So you go from 1 site to 3 sites. And then there are different colleges at your university, and the business school gets its own site, and the engineering college gets its own site, and the law school gets their own site, and libraries get their own site. And then there are research centers and labs and cross-disciplinary programs and other campuses and student groups. And you have to have all of these going at the same time, each redesigning and replatforming with different rhythms, each with different requirements and different competing sets of stakeholders, very few of whom actually think of themselves as part of a one university vision, but think of themselves as independent. How many folks in the room in the last 10 years have had an initiative at their campus to create a unified vision or a unified brand, a 1X? Yep, every higher ed institution I go to, we have a one Harvard vision, we have a one Washington State University vision, we have a one Northeastern vision. We're trying to get everybody together to think of themselves as part of the same university. Universities radically swing between centralized and decentralized, and often are stuck somewhere in the middle. Perry Hewitt, who for a while was the chief digital officer at Harvard University, used to say faculty don't think of themselves as part of Harvard. They think of Harvard as the place where their brilliance is temporarily parked, right? And I think that's kind of true. And then on the other end, I did some work with Case Western Reserve University. I don't know if anyone's in the room. Case and Western Reserve joined in 1967. In 2008, I went to visit them and do consulting and got business cards that said Case and business cards that said Western Reserve. 40 years later, right? Institutional memory is long and does not change. So one of the postulates that I've chosen to call it Ekman's Law because you get to name your own laws, is that given enough time, the number of websites produced by an institution of higher learning will exceed the number of current students, faculty, staff, departments, research labs, student groups, cross-discipline initiatives, right? More sites get created all the time, they never get retired in most cases. They're like tribbles, which is what's in the background there. There was a time where Acquia, under the Drupal brand, was trying to encourage their growth in higher education, and they had an offering called Acquia Site Factory. And I was like, that is so off base, because the last thing I need is a factory that produces more sites, right? I mean, it's just exactly the wrong kind of thing. So the question really shouldn't be, what platform does your institution use for content management? It should really be, what platforms are used, for what purposes, by whom, and how effectively. Right? The whole kind of CMS industry, and I use the word industry advisedly, is designed to convince people with money to buy platforms that will solve their problems and give the impression that that won't require hard work on their behalf. Right? So if you put the platform first, we think of CMS as a content management system. I've long talked about it should really be a content management strategy, of which the platform is just one smaller component. Right? It's a part of the bigger picture. It's really all about how you make that successful. That is the one ring to rule them all and in the darkness bind them, which is the quest for, we have one platform and we'll never use another. Even the places who have managed to get to sort of 90% WordPress or 95% WordPress typically have other things at the edges and in the fringes. And I actually think that's healthy, right? I don't think you should necessarily have as a target a single platform. So how does CMSs work in higher education? Administrative models, as I said, can vary wildly. In some cases, that means there's a web team or a digital team in marketing communications centralized for the university as a whole. In some cases, that means there's a web or Marcom or digital team in every college, in every department. More often, it's all of the above. So there's central marketing's digital web team, and then there's the digital web person at the College of Engineering, and then there's the digital web person inside the computer science department, inside the Department of Engineering. And then there's the person who owns the web for the research lab, who are all different. One of my first builds that I ever did was actually as an independent before joining a digital agency. I had built a site for the University of Washington Department of Microbiology. We're talking 1997, so it was very early Perl, CGI bin, Berkeley DB, what would have been called an open source thing, except open source as a term didn't exist yet, right? So it was just academic software. And then I got hired to build one for a lab within the Department of Microbiology. And I remember just naively saying, why wouldn't that just be a set of pages on the Department of Microbiology, right? And shocked looks from the administrators. Why on earth would that be the case, right? So you swing between federated and centralized, but in either case, what that often means is the decision about platform is made not by the people who will actually use the platform, but made by somebody else. In business cases, by which I mean non-academic businesses, the challenge is often between IT and what we call the business, which is usually marketing or sales. In higher ed, it's often sort of centralized IT versus individual departments and teams. I worked for a while with a team that we called the CMS myth. We wrote a lot about this challenge of how the CMS vendors take over the conversation. And one of the things that we used to do is actually hand out versions of this pain assessment tool laminated with a marker. So you could literally circle each day, how does your CMS make you feel? And you won't be surprised that most people spend most of their time in the last two quadrants, right? This is the Wong-Baker-Pain scale that you'll know if you have kids and take them to the hospital. Most people spend most of their time hating their CMS. That's just the reality. It's like the cable company of enterprise IT, right? Everybody hates the one they have, and it's a monopoly. WordPress users actually spend a lot more of their time over here. It's funny hanging out at WordPress conferences and people actually complaining about WordPress, but the complaints about WordPress are so loving and focused and targeted, and you go to other platform conferences and it's really more violent. It's a more deep-rooted hatred instead of one filled with love. So let's talk about what that marketplace looks like. So here's one version. There are hundreds of different versions of what the marketing landscape looks like. There's a great MarTech one that's so big it's just an eye chart. This really is from Real Story Group, which you might have known as CMS Watch before they were Real Story Group, an independent analyst firm that actually tries to help make sense of this world. WordPress is over here in the blue quadrant somewhere. And that whole blue line is meant to be the folks who deal with content management and web experience management. But it doesn't really help you get sort of a qualitative sense of how different platforms are different, other than some of them are nexuses of multiple lines. So if you live in a place where there isn't a subway, these are places where the multiple lines come together. And WordPress is not for some reason. I love Real Story Group. Tony Byrne is a great guy, but I think their coverage of WordPress minimizes its importance to the marketplace, which we'll talk about in a minute. If you want a more qualitative take, this is the CMS market as Game of Thrones characters. Again, not exactly sure what to read into WordPress as Tyrion Lannister. He is one of my favorite characters. I actually have a shirt that says, "That's what I do here. I drink and I know things," because that's Tyrion's famous quotes. I do like that sort of Jamie and Cersei are Oracle and Adobe. Yeah. It's kind of an incestuous big commercial relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean that one I sort of buy. Some of the others I'm not so sure about. I'm not sure how she feels about being Hippo. That feels like a slam in some weird way. Yeah, open text certainly is gone, so that makes sense to me. So what actually is the CMS market in higher ed? Well, it's incredibly difficult to figure that out, right? And part of the reason it's hard to figure out is the things I talked about before, which is there isn't a single answer. What institutions use is hard to figure out because there are lots of different things used within institutions. A large research institution, tier 1 public land grant school that I once worked with, actually engaged us because someone had written on a webpage somewhere some slanderous or potentially slanderous things about a university trustee. And the trustees had come to IT and said, we need to fix it. We need to shut this down. And IT said, I don't know who that is. Like, I don't know even what websites we have. So it started with a survey. Let's figure out what actual websites are published within the university domain, which you would think you would have a list of, but it's actually a lot harder to keep track than you think, right? So this is W3 Techs. This is the same people who tell us that WordPress powers 30% of the web, right? They're doing scraping. They're basically looking for identifying features across millions of sites. That gives them access to a certain amount of data, and I think it's fairly unsurprising that it's WordPress, Drupal, and WPCampus. But it's not the only way of looking. This is from the survey data that was published that Travis Tots talked about in 2017 that Leonard Todd did in conjunction with WPCampus. Not surprisingly, because it's a WPCampus survey, right? WordPress is nearly 100%. But if you look at the follow-ons, Drupal, SharePoint, and other. SharePoint that frightens me a little bit, but we'll talk about that. Other includes like Terminal 4, Electron, CommonSpot, Moodle, and a lot of like custom or everything, or I don't know, or I'm not really authorized to answer this question, or there's a bunch of interesting stuff in other. And I should have said at the beginning, these slides will be posted. There's links at the back for everything that's in here, so you can look up that survey data yourself. It's public. Here's another attempt. Greg Vance, a blogger, did a survey of his own. I have added n equals 96 because I'm not actually sure if he allowed people to do multiple answers or whatever. He isn't really clear about where the data came from, but Cascade, top, then Drupal, then Omni Update, then WordPress. Interesting, Greg is actually in business development for Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, which itself is a WordPress site. So I'm not exactly sure what the bias is in his sample. This is then from Equify. I think it's Equify. It's EQAFY. They're a UK company that works with a lot of higher ed marketing teams. maybe it's Equify, I'm not sure. But so they did a survey for them. This is 135 people. Again, significant over 30% presence for Drupal, WordPress, Cascade, Omni Update, Common Spot, AEM, Terminal 4. One of the things that's interesting as you start to do this is everybody identifies their CMS platforms differently. So like they always say Cascade Server, but other people will say Hand and Hill. There's also Cascade Cloud, so it's really kind of confusing which one you mean. Do they capitalize the C in Sitecore, which they're not supposed to do, but do in this case? Do they put lowercase p in WordPress, which Tony Byrne does all the time at Real Story Group, but isn't right? Like just even how you name them is different. This one is slightly better and slightly later. This is November 2016. This is also Equify. This, they got 2575 responses, and this is only in the US. So given there are 5,000 degree granting institutions or so in the US, 2,600 is a pretty solid number. And it starts to actually model the W3 text numbers, right? With WordPress, Drupal, and Omni Update, all in the above 5%, and then Cascade as the last of the above 5%. And then descending on down into a very, very, very long tail, right? So trying to get a handle on what all these platforms are, I sort of made my own taxonomy, which is one of my favorite first-year professors of English used to say, in the end, it matters very little what taxonomy we use. The point is that we made one, right? And we made a series of distinctions and divided them up, and that's what's useful about it. It's not that that taxonomy is right. So I think of this world in 4 quadrants. There's commercial general, which is the Adobe Experience Managers and Sitecores. These are big platforms aimed largely at commercial enterprises. They're proprietary, they have licensing fees. They sometimes find their way into higher ed, I would say, rather than necessarily targeting higher ed, right? Sitecore maybe targets higher ed more than AEM does, but nevertheless, they both find themselves that way. Then there's the more higher ed focused platforms. I used a Hand and Hill logo because none of the Cascade logos make any sense in the absence of context, so I just used Hand and Hill. WPCampus and Terminal 4. These are commercial platforms with a very explicit focus on campus, right? WPCampus puts it in their name. And then open source general, I'm going to talk mostly about Drupal. There are a lot of other open source platforms which we can get into. And then there's other. So what's in other? Bespoke, we built our own. We're happily, I think, past the era of everybody building their own CMS. Mostly, I think there's still a little bit of that reappearing here and there, but most of the time when we get contacted by somebody who's using a bespoke CMS, it's because they're migrating out of it, not because they want to keep working on it, right? Which is brilliant. There was a time where every agency worth its salt tried to create their own CMS, but happily we're past that. So I'm going to go through each of those categories a little bit. So why do Sitecore or Adobe Experience Manager end up in higher ed? How do they manage to convince an institution that Sitecore or Adobe Experience Manager is the right fit? I think the biggest and most important thing is they speak the language of business, right? It is no coincidence that most of the places, and I wish the survey data was more granular here, most of the places in my experience where I've seen Sitecore, what school is it on campus?
Business.
It's a business school, almost always. Maybe it's admissions, enrollment management, right? Sort of people who are more marketing savvy. Maybe it's commercial extension. I actually designed and built a Sitecore-based platform for exec ed at Wharton, right? Which is like their professional, non-accredited, expensive teach executives courses, and that Sitecore is a really good fit for. What Sitecore does incredibly well is this kind of cell of personalization, right? So they talk about their experience database, which is the thing that is combined. It used to be there were 2 separate platforms, the CMS and the digital marketing suite, and then they combined them together. It's tracking everything that a user does on the site, anonymous or logged in. And the CMS itself, at the point at which it's presenting any content, has access to that full set of information. So it can do things like, gee, this visitor, the last 15 times that they visited the site, 70% of the time they're looking at pages on admissions. They're probably interested in admissions. Now I can give them a call to action that's about admissions. This other user, 75% of the time when they visit the site, they're looking at pages on the campus map. Maybe their call to action should be something about a parking pass or something that's more appropriate to that, right? So they can personalize and target that content. There are ways to accomplish that in other platforms, of course, including in WordPress. But Sitecore having that kind of built into the suite can demo really effectively to people who want to do personalized marketing. And the reason I keep saying demo is because most businesses who end up buying Sitecore never use that feature. The CMS myth we talked about, personalization is the day 2 that never arrives. If you think about the struggle it is for most of our stakeholders to get one correct version of content on the web at the right time to the right person, now try to think about every single page having 15 variants based on which of these different categories you fit into, right? It's impossible. They just can't handle the extra effort. Again, this person to personalize experiences at scale, right? The idea that the platform is going to personalize the experience and it's not going to require intervention by humans is the sell here, right? All this personalization just happens magically without people going in and setting rules and determining what kind of audiences they have and what kind of things they can offer those audiences and all that. I mean, it's craziness. I think, and this is guessing about people's motives, I think it's aspirational. I think Sitecore speaks to the, I want to run my university like a business. I want to show that I'm a business person. I want to do marketing with a capital M. I'm important with a capital I. I can do personalization just like Dow and P&G and L'Oreal and Royal Caribbean and all their big corporate clients. And they win the analyst vote, right? Gartner, Forrester, Sitecore as a commercial player plays well in that space. Sitecore's position is advanced every year. All right, I need to speed up. Adobe Experience Manager. Again, digital experience management, not just CMS. It's a part of Adobe Marketing Cloud, right? I think the no one ever got fired for hiring IBM is now no one ever got fired for hiring Adobe. If you think back to an era in which you actually used Adobe Photoshop, right? Before you started using Sketch and Figma and before Creative Suite became, or when Creative Suite was still the dominant thing, attaching Adobe to your digital marketing makes perfect sense. I remember in 2004 and 2005 being like, why doesn't Adobe have a CMS, right? They have all these other tools for creating content. They own all these other things. They bought Macromedia, and yet they never had a CMS. Well, now they do because they bought CQ5, but it's still pitched as though it's part of Adobe, even though sort of 3 screens in, you'll see old CQ5 labeling, right? Because they haven't really rebuilt it. So web content, experience management, omni-channel, you can compete with all the proprietary, you can compete with everybody. 7 years as a leader in the same magic quadrant that Sitecore was just saying they're the leader in, because everybody can say they're the leader as long as they're in the right quadrant, right? That's how this works. Very strong demo, very difficult deployment, very difficult to use. So how do you respond when these happen? When you hear this being explored in your environment? Well, one is to point out the costs, right? So everybody knows the open source is free, as in speech, not as in beer. Also doesn't have any licensing costs, right? So it's also free as in beer. A lot of times what people in the proprietary software world will talk about is they'll say open source is free as in puppies, as in you get them for free, but then you require a lot of investment and care and feeding to make them successful. To which my response is always, don't you have to do the same with expensive purebred dogs that you buy from a group? Like, yes, you AEM or Sitecore, you're going to pay the licensing cost, and you're going to spend 2 to 3 times that in implementation, because out of the box is a lie. No CMS platform could possibly be out of the box, because the whole point is it should be about your content and your experience and your users, and like you're always going to have to do that. Trying to speed up. Drupal. Drupal's a fantastic system. I spent a lot of time in the Drupal community. I contributed to Drupal 8. I used to have user contrib modules in 6 and 7. I have keynoted a lot of Drupal camps locally. The right team can do incredible things with Drupal. Drupal has this notion of sort of site builders or power users, who are people who don't write a line of code, but assemble features and recipes and modules and can use views and CCK and sort of ways of configuring content types all through the admin, can build really incredible sites without ever writing a single line of code. In the Drupal community, developers will write thousands of lines of code to expose a complicated admin interface to a user so that they can do something without writing any code. In the WordPress world, we will write thousands of lines of code to avoid having to put a checkbox in the admin, because we want to make it simple and we want design, we want opinionated design, right? They have distributions. So there are distributions tailored to specific kinds of higher ed. So there's a OpenEdu distribution, there's a Open Scholar distribution, there's an Open Publish distribution. These are like pre-configured sets of modules designed to work together, and they're supported as a first-class citizen throughout the Drupal community, so they all know how they work. Their modules can have dependencies. So there are multiple ways to sort of put modules together. And because they have a defined fields API, the way a date picker works in one plugin can be extended across the entire thing. You don't have this weird, did somebody use ACF, or did they custom code their custom fields, or how did they do their meta boxes? There's a standard way to do it in core that's been there for a long time that's well understood. So when Drupal comes in, how do you respond? That's an aircraft carrier to imply their cost is heavy. The most important thing is it may actually be better to cooperate, because the fact that you're going down an open source path, to me, is actually probably more important than the fact of whether it's Drupal or WordPress, because it's at least going to have the kind of openness that you're going to need and the kind of community that you're going to need. But recognize that that first step in the learning curve is very steep, right? It is not easy to get up to speed with what it means to have an actually effective Drupal team. Major versions in Drupal tend to break back compatibility. What that means is when you go from 6 to 7 or from 7 to 8, you build a new site and migrate your content into it. You don't really upgrade. There's a thing that's called upgrading, but it's not upgrading like we know it. It's really build a new site and migrate your content into it. Whether that's a problem for you depends on whether you have the budget to do a $300,000 to $500,000 redesign every 3 years, which in higher ed you generally don't, right? Which is why in the Drupal community, then there's a fork called Backdrop that stayed back at 7 for a lot of educational institutions who couldn't actually afford to go to 8, but wanted to stay in the Drupal world, so they can be on this thing called Backdrop that's Drupal 7 with the security backports. The other thing that I like to point out is in the Drupal community, this is getting better, but I think it's still fair to say the developer experience is more important than the author or editor experience. Historically, that was so true that I used to dread in doing Drupal work with clients the day they would actually see the admin and learn how they were going to edit content. Because you just knew that there was this reaction coming. No one sees the Drupal admin and immediately says, oh, I love this, it's intuitive, it means you do this, right? It just doesn't happen. It's gotten better, but it's clear that the priority, if you think about sort of the WordPress philosophy, right, and you go to wordpress.org/about/philosophy, designing for the majority, keep it simple, right, should work out of the box, focus on the 80%, decisions on options, all of those things. The Drupal development philosophy is architectural elegance, object-oriented, use the latest features of PHP, incorporate other existing libraries, right, so they've sucked in Symfony and a bunch of other things. It makes for a great developer experience, especially for somebody who lives and breathes in that world. But it also makes that first step really hard, and it tends not to focus on the benefit to the users, right? So they'll rewrite an entire module for architectural elegance without making any actual end user improvements at all. In the WordPress world, we'll keep piling on user experience improvements without ever actually fixing underlying architecture. So it is a challenge. Complexity from dependency management. This is one that actually caught me by surprise, having built a number of Drupal sites and then tried to maintain them over the years. Just how complex it became that this module depended on this version of something, but this other module depended on a different version of something, and it was like DLL hell all over again. It was all of a sudden now I was having to decide. I could upgrade this one, but that's going to break this other one because they actually depend on different versions. So that's a benefit or a challenge. All right, 2 o'clock. Other open source. So in the higher ed world, Easy Publish, Typo3, Umbraco, maybe even Reason CMS. Anybody here from Carleton? Not Carleton University, Carleton College. You see a lot of sort of smaller open source players in the higher ed world. Again, kind of usually there's some kind of connection that got them to choose that platform. The challenge is always for me, how much are we putting ourselves on a small island, right? So Easy Publish, as an example, is a fantastic system out of Norway, PHP and MySQL based. Very few users in the US, very few developers in the US, right? So if you want to fly to Norway for the Easy Publish conference every year, which actually is not a bad idea, that's great. But if you are sort of building on an open source platform because you want to be going in a direction that a large scale community is going, because you want a community where in any given city in the world, there is a meetup once a month of people getting together to talk about that platform, you can't be choosing a niche platform, right? So the way I like to think about these is like, what's our investment? How much of an experiment is this? Is this something we're betting the future of the university on? Is this something we're experimenting with because we want to have a healthy understanding of how other platforms operate, and we're getting our content into it in a way that we can get content out when we need to? So maybe this is a microsite for an initiative that's going to live for a couple of years and then go away. Maybe this is a new interdisciplinary lab, something that we can experiment with and try out so that we have a sense of what's going on in other platforms, but it doesn't become something that we strand ourselves on. So why would you use Cascade or OmniUpdate or T4? Any users of those platforms in the room? We can't see you on the live stream, so.
Our
A couple
school,
of dabblers.
I'm totally uninvolved. Our school just refreshed. It just went live 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think
Server
we're
8,
one
probably.
of these things. It's some sort of proprietary thing that
Yep.
has a whole lot of XSLT
Okay.
transforms.
Yep, that's probably Cascade. So
Okay.
and again, this is another beautiful lawn, Oxford. Again, I don't know why, the European ones. So Hammond Hill, makers of Cascade CMS. Cascade Server is the installed version. There's also Cascade Cloud, which is the kind of SaaS version. Historically, I think Server was more dominant, but now Cloud is something that is a big push. 24,000 sites and 100,000 users. So they have this map of their dominance in higher ed. 24,000 sites, what I don't know is like, I mean, WSU probably has 24,000 sites. I don't know if they mean different campuses, right, or different institutions, but 100,000 users. It's a sizable community, right? This isn't an island where you're going to get stranded and nobody's going to know Cascade. They have an annual user conference in Atlanta. It's XSLT and Velocity, Java-based, uses a separate CMS server and then pushes content to front ends. So you can have different kind of web heads, right? It's decoupled before it was cool because they were always that way, much like, say, movable type. OU Campus, interesting thing about OU Campus or Omni Update is they do all their own implementation. So usually part of the selection process is you're picking a platform and then you're picking a partner to do it. You can only get Sitecore from a Sitecore licensed partner. Some agency is going to do the build for you. OU Update does it all themselves. It's all inclusive, all in one. They own everything. They take care of it for you. Like Cascade, they also have an interesting edit in page in context model, right? Where you actually sort of log into the site and you're looking at the front end, but with editor permissions, you can click in and edit. All because, again, it's decoupled, right? So it pushes out via SFTP to the front end, which lets them do some interesting things on the back end. Terminal 4 out of Dublin. The great thing about Terminal 4 is if you watch all their videos, you get to hear lovely Irish accents while they walk through how their systems work. I find that interesting. US headquarters in Boston, also direct edit in place, also loosely coupled. What's interesting to me is for some reason, all 3 of these platforms are all in that decoupled world where they sort of edit the content in one place and then push it somewhere else for delivery. I'm not sure if that was attractive to higher ed at the right moment when these were formed back in the early 2000s or something. But so how do you respond when you have these? Or what's attractive about them to buyers, right? Why would you end up with these? I had earlier an animated GIF of the Nancy Kerrigan going, "Why?" when her knee was. I decided that was a little too snarky, so I took it out. Because they offer reduced need for in-house development, right? They offer the promise of like, we're going to take care of everything for you. One throat to choke was the old IT management adage, right? You have one person who takes care of all of this. If you are a relatively small institution with a relatively small digital team and a relatively small IT team in particular, there's something very attractive about this small boutique business that focuses on our space, focuses on higher ed, understands our problems, hasn't spent time building features we don't need, right? So they're not out trying to compete with L'Oreal and Royal Caribbean or Microsoft or whatever. They're trying to stay simpler. They're trying to stay focused on the kinds of problems that we have, and they have a presence in our niche. So how do you respond? Well, you don't want to get on a sinking ship. I think, and again, data here is sparse, I think each of those is shrinking. I think they're increasingly, universities are moving away from those smaller focused niche platforms, probably because they're recognizing they need more of the complexity than they thought they did. And the single throat to choke isn't as helpful as they thought it would be. When I was at a previous agency, we were trying to get people to understand the value of open source. And we flipped our engagement, we flipped our story around. And instead of trying to talk to CIOs about why are you doing open source engineering, we would say, are you practicing isolated engineering? And they, I haven't heard that. In other words, your team is only allowed to talk to each other, and they're not allowed to engage with the rest of the world. So you've decided the 20 people you hired are smarter than the 2 billion developers out there, right? And that's sort of what this means when you join one of these proprietary platforms. How could they possibly keep up with the speed of the development community, right? So I would say, like, when AMP came out, how soon was AMP available on your platform? When responsive web became a thing, how quickly were you able to adapt to that? When a new feature comes out that you're going to need or a new form of authentication, how responsive are they to getting that out quickly? And it's not because they're bad people or they make bad priority decisions or whatever. It's just because they have a relatively small team compared against the size of a WordPress community or a Drupal community. Are we renting expensively instead of buying something we really need to own? Right? This whole ownership question. How am I going to get my content out? How much control do I really have? And am I sort of abdicating my responsibility to really own the experience in handing it off to these third parties? It's harder for me to sort of respond to these because you can't kind of be partially in, right? They tend to be fairly holistic. I was interested to see it was Lacey's presentation the other day, their multi-tenant apartment building, and then they had like 300 that were still in Cascade. Because it tends to be kind of all or nothing, right? It tends to be all or nothing at all. So if this was kind of creeping into campus, I guess those are the things that I would be pushing on, and I would be trying to understand what the long-term game is. Because in the short term, these can sound very attractive, but I think when you think about the sort of longer term, that's where it starts to be more of a challenge. The other thing that that Omni Update and Cascade in particular do well, I don't think Terminal 4 does as well, maybe they do this in Europe, is market to the higher ed community. Right, so I spend a lot of my time in the WordPress community, of which higher ed is a fraction, instead of the higher ed community, of which WordPress is a fraction. They have a big presence at higher ed web and associated kinds of conferences. So, how to respond overall? Be open to learning. Seek first to understand. If you've seen me give presentations anywhere, you'll know that's a theme that runs through all of my talks, not just this one. And I really mean it, and that means like authentically, right? So you're not just going to meetings with departments that are exploring these other options so that you can sit quietly and then tell them all the reasons they're wrong, right? And spend your whole hour listening to the presentation from the vendor, thinking through in your head, here's all the reasons they're wrong. Actually try to understand it, right? And figure out if what they're doing makes sense for them. Go beyond marketing to getting real hands-on experience, right? The thing that commercial software has working to its advantage is the practiced, rehearsed demo, right? This is a place where they invest a lot of time and energy. This is a place where they practice. This is a place where they know what they're doing. The more that you can break that scenario and get into random questions they haven't considered before, real scenarios, people like Real Story Group actually will help walk companies through this and have a scenario-based planning process where they go through. Don't just ask them, do you support multiple sites? Because the answer is going to be yes, right? If you have a checklist, they have designed the feature set for the CMS to fill as many of those checklist boxes as possible. It doesn't mean they do them particularly well or in a way that's useful or in the way that you want them to, but you need to get beyond that and into how would we actually do this, right? With a real example, with real content, with real existing sites, how would we actually do this? You may need to spend some money to do that, right? You may actually need to pay a partner to actually do some prototype implementation. You may need to spend some time to do it. But it's worth getting some real hands-on experience. And that means both for the developers and for the actual editors and authors and site managers and people who are going to spend time in the platform, right? If you're doing a CMS selection and you don't have along with it a group of authors and editors who are participating, you're doing it wrong. Integrate. Be open to a multi-platform ecosystem. Again, recognize that the days of sort of a single platform for everybody are fast disappearing. Recognize that you're already integrating with authentication services, with social, with search, with all kinds of other platforms, right? And you should live and breathe in that multi-platform ecosystem. We now have the REST API, we have headless options, we have lots of great ways to integrate WordPress as a platform. So think about the right platform for the right purpose. Share data, share experiences, create community, have a web steering group, right? Don't just think about sort of what you're doing in your department or your part of the university, but actually try to actively engage the folks in the rest of the university. And remember, at the end of the day, the platform is not the thing. There are probably a dozen or more, maybe 6 to 12 CMS platforms on which you could succeed at building out a set of digital experiences. There are an infinite number of platforms on which you can fail, right? Picking the right platform is only a very small part of the experience. It's much more about how well you understand your needs, how well you plan for a sustainable content strategy to not just produce content for the site, but keep it updated. All the training and office hours and cat herding and architecture planning and all of the other things that all the talks at this conference have been about are more important than what platform you're doing them on. It's not to say there aren't platforms I would not choose to work on. I've chosen to work at 10up for the last 4 years and forever. because I enjoy working with WordPress as a platform, and I think it offers the best trade-off of all of the different questions that are involved in CMS selection. But it is not going to be the right platform for everyone, and that's fine. I'm just not going to build those other platforms. So I've got 4 minutes for questions. And slides are at that SlideShare URL. I didn't put the whole one to this presentation because it's wicked long and I'm lazy, but if you go there, you'll find it. Questions?
No in the room, going once.
I understand the live stream Q&A doesn't actually exist, so unless somebody wants to.
All right, let's give a hand to John. Oh, no, wait. Jeremy's got a question. Hang on.
Jeremy first.
Hold the phone.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from last time.
One thing I'm not sure you mentioned is other CMS platforms built on WordPress, like WordPress. Have you seen other things besides that?
It's true, I did not. The question for live stream, who probably can't hear it, was about other platforms built on top of WordPress as a base, so things like CampusPress. I think there was Edublogs. I haven't worked with them a lot. I think they would still show up in all of these surveys as WordPress, right? Because they're still sort of under the hood WordPress as a platform. I think depending on fit to purpose, they can be a fantastic thing. I think what ends up being tricky is like if they're a fit for the university sites, right? Lots of different places have like Yale sites or Harvard sites or whatever. For those student organizations and individual faculty and sort of lightweight individualistic sites, a large number of small sites might be a fit for one of those kinds of platforms. But then for the rest of the university, you're trying to do a more custom controlled multi-site thing. You get in a weird kind of situation where you're partially in and partially out. And I think that might be difficult. But so long as you sort of knew that going in, I think that would be interesting. I also didn't talk a lot about the custom side or the bespoke side, which is people building on React or Node or like Django and Python or one of those kinds of platforms. And I think there it's fundamentally about like, where is our core data structure going to live and how are we going to manage that? And then take advantage of the sort of pace layering of change, right? Think about using an architecture metaphor again. What changes most infrequently is the location inside of the building. What changes next infrequently is the core built foundational infrastructure, the pillars and the walls and everything, right? The supporting structure. Then it's like HVAC and piping and electricity and everything. Then it's the rooms and then it's interior design, right? So the most frequently changing is the contents of the room and the interior design. Least frequently changing is the whole foundational infrastructure. Think about that when you're doing architecture planning. So if we are going to build a front end that we're going to throw away in a year, great. As long as the core data structure actually gets managed in a way that keeps us moving in the right direction and lets us future-proof. On the other hand, if we're building something and we're starting to structure content in it, and it's structured in such a way that we're not going to be able to get it out easily, then I worry much more about that investment, right? Because I'm sort of building on a platform that I don't know. Cool. Brad, were you going to give me a softball?
Answer a question. So let's just say if a customer, for some reason, didn't want to use WordPress at all, what would be your next choice?
In higher ed, I think my next choice would probably be Drupal. Honestly, if I was thinking about it holistically and cohesively as a whole kind of institution long-term bet, if it were more of a one-off kind of quick build thing, I think we've also had some luck with things like Jekyll or sort of static site generators or sort of smaller, lightweight PHP-based platforms. I would beware of we're going to build our own in Laravel or Django or whatever. I would stay away from that. But I think it really is fit to purpose, right? I think there are businesses who are well served by the commercial platforms. They just need to know kind of what they're getting into and why they're going down that path. Thank you. All right, thanks. Yeah, I think we have to quit, but you can come up and chat with me.
Yeah, let's give a hand. John, thank you.